There are planes that fight wars, and then there are planes that become legend. The difference isn't something you can draft on paper or weld together in a factory. It's something deeper, something almost impossible to define. A truly great warbird needs more than engineering brilliance. It needs that spark of genius that lifts it beyond the merely good, beyond the capable, into something unforgettable. But most of all, it needs luck. The kind of luck that puts it in the right sky at the right moment, when history itself is watching. It needs to fly like a dream, absorb punishment like a heavyweight champion, and hit back twice as hard. And in the end, it needs crews who don't just fly it, they fall in love with it, trust it with their lives, and carry its story home. The Avro Lancaster had all of this and more, in measures that defied expectation. Despite those bulky power-operated gun turrets, those ugly necessities that haunted every bomber designer trying to cut through the air cleanly, the Lancaster somehow managed to look graceful. Its lines were smooth, purposeful, almost elegant in a way that made you stop and stare. That beauty wasn't just skin-deep either. Every curve contributed to performance that pilots praised and enemies feared. But like all the great ones, the Lancaster's real genius was in its simplicity. Its frame was robust, practical, built for the assembly lines that would churn out thousands of them, and that simplicity became one of its greatest strengths. It was adaptable too, a chameleon that could carry whatever the mission demanded. At first, it hauled 4,000-pound bombs and smaller ordnance deep into the heart of Germany, night after night. Before long, it became the Royal Air Force's primary weapon, the tip of the spear aimed at the Third Reich. By April of 1942, it was dropping 8,000-pound bombs. A year later, that jumped to 12,000 pounds. Early missions relied on dead reckoning navigation, eyes squinting through darkness, bomb aimers calculating manually as flak burst around them. But technology caught up. Radar navigation aids like Rebecca G and Oboe gave them an edge, and the H-2S radar bombing system, with its distinctive semi-opaque blister hanging beneath the rear fuselage, became standard equipment. Then came the bouncing bomb, the weapon that would make history. 617 Squadron, those immortals, carried it on one of the war's most audacious raids, skipping those spinning cylinders across reservoir surfaces to shatter the Emschen and Sorp dams in the Ruhr Valley. Sir Arthur Harris, Bomber Command's wartime chief, called the Lancaster the finest bomber of the war, and he meant every word. Its efficiency was almost unbelievable, he said, both in raw performance and in its ability to shoulder ever-increasing bomb loads without breaking. The survival rate inside a Lancaster far surpassed every other heavy bomber in the sky. It could carry heavier payloads, handle easier in the worst weather, and most importantly to the young men strapped inside, it brought more of them home alive. The casualty rate was consistently lower, mission after mission, year after year. Of all the great machines that fought their way through that terrible war, many would argue the Lancaster stood alone at the top. Before the Lancaster, though, there was the Whitley, the workhorse that carried the Royal Air Force through those first brutal years when the seeds of strategic night bombing were just being planted. It wasn't much to look at, one of the least appealing bombers ever built, but the Whitley represented something crucial, a landmark in the RAV's ability to strike back. Then there was the Vickers Wellington, a bomber with one of the longest and most distinguished operational careers of the entire war. It saw combat from the very first day of hostilities, carried the lion's share of RAF Bomber Command's night offensive until the 4-engine heavies arrived, and was still flying frontline missions when Germany surrendered. The Wellington's brilliance lay in its docility combined with lively performance and an almost supernatural ability to absorb battle damage and keep flying. Crews loved it instantly. Its portly, well-fed appearance earned it the nickname Wimpy, after the cartoon character who loved hamburgers. More than any other bomber, the Wellington proved that power-operated gun turrets could be devastating defensive weapons. But it also proved, tragically, that large bombers couldn't survive daylight raids against heavily defended targets without fighter escort. The Wellington owed its legendary toughness to Barnes-Wallace's revolutionary geodetic construction, that ingenious basket weave framework that was as brilliant as it was simple. Before 1939 ended, the Wellington learned a hard lesson in blood. 10 Wellingtons were shot down and 3 more crippled out of a formation of 24, attempting an armed reconnaissance over Wilhelmshaven and the Schillig roads. From that day forward, the Wellington never flew daylight missions unescorted again, except in coastal and transport commands. Transferred to nighttime operations, it operated with conspicuous success, spearheading the Reyes night offensive against Germany. The Wellington was an airplane worthy of the Royal Air Force, bearing with distinction the name of a great British soldier. Other bombers came forward as the war ground on, but none enjoyed a finer reputation. When the Bristol Blenheim made its debut in the summer of 1936, it was immediately hailed as a major leap forward, placing British aircraft design at the forefront of fast-day bomber development. It was the first modern all-metal cantilever monoplane with stressed skin construction ordered into production for the RAF, marking the beginning of a new era. For years, acute anxiety had gripped British military minds over the obsolescence of RAF equipment, anxiety sharpened by what was happening in Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The Blenheim's emergence, such a tremendous technical advance over everything before it, did much to quiet those fears. More than any other plane, it hammered the final nail into the coffin of the fighting biplane era, setting a design pattern other nations rushed to copy. Yet the Blenheim was fated never to fulfill those sky-high hopes. Selected as a key type for re-equipping the rapidly expanding RAF of the late 30s, the Blenheim possessed performance that let it outpace most contemporary fighters when it entered service. But combat aircraft evolution moved at lightning speed during those last 2 years of peace in Europe. When the RAF went to war in September 1939, they discovered quickly that the Blenheim wasn't the formidable weapon they'd believed it to be. Its shortcomings manifested themselves brutally in aerial combat. It proved woefully vulnerable to fighter attack, deficient in both defensive armament and armor protection. Nevertheless, it bore the brunt of fighting on every front where the RAF was committed during the war's first 3 years. Despite its limitations, it served valorously, almost tragically so. You could draw a parallel between the Blenheim and the American Curtiss P-40. Both were praised and abused, lauded and vilified, but they were all that was available when the bullets started flying. However divided opinions were about the Blenheim's effectiveness, it earned its place as one of the truly historic aircraft of the war. The short Stirling wasn't just the first of the Royal Air Force's true heavy bombers of World War II. It was the only British 4-engine bomber designed from the outset, with 4 power plants to see operational service during the conflict. The Lancaster and Halifax both evolved from twin-engine designs, but the Stirling was born as a heavyweight. Carrying bomb loads far greater than anyone had previously imagined possible, the Stirling proved to be a landmark in RAF history. Yet the official history would later refer to it as a disappointment, and consequently, its career as a frontline heavy bomber was relatively brief. Still, as the RAF's first 4-engine heavy, the Stirling occupied a particularly important place in aviation history. The Avro Manchester, the Lancaster's predecessor, was not a successful bomber, proving unreliable and underpowered. Only 209 were built before production ceased after barely a year. The Handley Page Halifax, after working through initial teething problems, developed into an outstanding aircraft, remaining in service until war's end as one of the 2 principal RAF heavy bombers. The Handley Page Hampton was one of the world's most advanced warplanes when it debuted, coming from a distinguished lineage. It was forgiving from a pilot's perspective, its ease of control making it extremely pleasant to fly. Small enough to be highly maneuverable, Its cockpit offered a fighter-like field of vision, and it possessed a remarkable speed range that kept it relevant longer than expected. Named after William Mitchell, that far-sighted, crusading American colonel of the 1920s who was court-martialed for his outspoken views on air power and posthumously promoted to brigadier general. The North American B-25, Mitchell was possibly the best all-around light-medium bomber of World War II, operationally efficient. This docile, adaptable machine had excellent all-around performance with particularly good handling characteristics, making it one of the most popular combat aircraft among Allied aircrews. Even if the Mitchell had never attacked another target after April 1942, it would still rank among the most historic aircraft of the war for that one fantastic, audacious raid against Tokyo when 16 of them launched from the pitching deck of the USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. It was manufactured in larger quantities than any other American twin-engine bomber, with no fewer than 9,816 Mitchells accepted by the U.S. Army Air Forces, though many found their way to British, Soviet, and other Allied air forces. The peak number of Mitchells in U.S. service never exceeded 2,656 aircraft, but this exceptionally fine bomber made its mark on every far-flung front of the war. One of the select band of Allied aircraft that could claim service on every major battlefront of World War II, the Mitchell built up an unrivaled tradition of service. There are few more dramatic examples of consistent development under the brutal pressures of war than this remarkable aircraft, which lingered on in service with air forces around the world far into the post-war era. Few other aircraft gained the universal affection of their aircrews over such a long operational period as the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. This legendary machine formed the spearhead of the American bombing offensive in Europe from beginning to end, while also serving in every other theater of war. No single aircraft type contributed more to the defeat of the Luftwaffe, both in the air and on the ground, than the Fortress, which gave tangible expression to the controversial United States policy of strategic daylight bombing against Germany in the face of formidable political argument and desperate enemy opposition. A curious feature of the Fortress's history is that its reputation as the leading Allied day bomber was established despite its inferiority in many performance aspects compared to its combat contemporary, the B-24 Liberator. The bomb load of U.S. Army Air Force fortresses over Europe was usually no more than that carried by the diminutive de Havilland Mosquito. Far fewer fortresses than Liberators were built, 12,677 fortresses being accepted between July 1940 and August 1945, equipping a maximum of 33 overseas combat groups by August 1944. The Fortress achieved fame on the strength of several outstanding attributes. Perhaps most important were an excellent high-altitude capability and an almost supernatural ability to absorb battle damage and keep flying. To these were added, in later variants, exceptionally heavy defensive armament, though the Fortress's true combat potential was achieved only after a long period of development and bloodshed. The Fortress dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs on European targets during the war, compared to 452,580 tons by B-24 Liberators and 463,544 tons by all other aircraft combined. According to records compiled by Boeing, the Fortress destroyed 23 enemy aircraft per 1,000 sorties, compared to 11 by B-24 Liberators, 11 by United States fighters, and 3 by all U.S. light and medium bombers. Though it's been established that the very high claims of enemy kills scored by Fortress gunners were greatly exaggerated, there's no doubt the total was formidable. By its almost unrivaled period of frontline service, the Fortress proved itself one of the classic bomber designs of all time, a triumphant vindication of the principles of air strategy and bomber design established by a few far-sighted American airmen and engineers long before World War II, while the Boeing B-29 Superfortress gained undying fame as the first aircraft to drop an atomic weapon, bringing about the sudden end of hostilities in the Pacific. It also deserves its place in aviation warfare history as one of the principal Allied weapons in the war against Japan. The laborious and costly island-hopping campaign conducted across the Pacific by Allied forces was undertaken largely to seize bases for superfortress operations against the Japanese homeland. Once those bases were established, the superfortresses of the United States 20th Air Force systematically and inexorably erased Japan's industrial cities one by one with the terrible weapon of fire. The closely packed, lightly constructed Japanese buildings were extremely vulnerable to incendiary attacks, and the destruction wreaked by superfortresses in some built-up areas amounted to as much as 99.5%. In addition to these devastating blows against strategic targets, superfortresses were simultaneously employed on a highly successful mine-laying campaign in Japanese home waters, applying an economic and logistic stranglehold to the islands of Nippon. The delivery of the 2 atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki was therefore in the nature of a coup de grace, though essential to shorten the war and save countless American lives. The superfortress was largely responsible for Japan's final defeat and surrender without invasion, the instrument that provided the ultimate vindication of American visionaries of strategic air power. The superfortress made an immense contribution to subsequent bomber design. It was the Second World War's heaviest production warplane and the first pressurized aircraft to reach large-scale production. It was also the first to make extensive use of remotely controlled armament. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of its history was that it was designed, built, tested, and placed in operational service within 4 years, an achievement that still astounds aviation historians. Although each bomber type had its staunch adherents, the consolidated B-24 Liberator was somewhat overshadowed in fame, if not in achievement, by the Boeing Fortress during World War II. This was despite the fact that the Liberator was built in considerably larger numbers, produced in greater quantities than any other American aircraft in history. Such a unique production record is all the more remarkable for such a large 4-engine aircraft. The Liberator operated over more fronts for a longer period and was produced in a greater variety of versions than any other Allied or enemy bomber. Compared to the Fortress, the Liberator was an ugly duckling. Its deep, slab-sided fuselage and immense barn door-like vertical tail surfaces were features hardly indicative of speed and agility. One of the prime virtues of the Liberator, and one which invariably hallmarks a great warplane, was its versatility. In addition to strategic bombing, it was used with equal facility for maritime reconnaissance and anti-submarine operations, passenger and freight transportation, as a flying tanker for photographic reconnaissance, and for many other duties. It was this quality that largely accounted for the extraordinary total of 18,188 Liberators and variants constructed, with deliveries between June 1941 and the closing of the last assembly line on May 31, 1945. Apart from its unchallenged production record, the Liberator earned a permanent place in aviation history for its remarkable record of achievement. Whether the material to be delivered was bombs, depth charges, gasoline, freight, troops, or VIPs, the Liberator established a reputation second to none for doing almost any job anywhere. In some respects, the combat career of the WW2 was less spectacular than other bombers. It wasn't associated with any single outstanding operation, but remained in frontline service throughout the war. It didn't distinguish itself on any particular battlefront, but flew with equal distinction over all of them, performing as well in Russia as it did in the Pacific or the Western Desert. Designated by the Americans as the Havoc and by the British as the Boston, the A-20 was a pilot's airplane. its virtues sworn to in a variety of languages ranging from Afrikaans to French, from British English to Ukrainian, as well as by Americans and Australians. Its cosmopolitan nature was fundamental to its design, owing its origins to lessons learned in the Spanish Civil War and the urgent rearmament needs of the French. Well suited to the low-level bomber role, the Boston and Havoc variants were adaptable, reliable, tractable, and extremely potent, possibly overshadowed throughout much of its career by more spectacular exploits that fell to other bombers. The A-20 ranked highly among the most brilliant combat aircraft designs evolved by the United States aircraft industry. No combat aircraft of World War II, either Axis or Allied, was the subject of so much modification and improvisation as the Junkers WW-88. Operating in various forms throughout the entire European war and still in production when hostilities ceased, the WW-88 was the true backbone of the Luftwaffe. This bomber was produced in greater numbers than all other German bombers combined, some 15,000 being built between 1939 and 1945. The WW-88 was continuously adapted to perform roles other than that for which it had been conceived, performing every task demanded of it with distinction. Like all combat aircraft, it possessed its share of shortcomings, largely due to changes dictated by the needs of overstrained and depleted German defenses during the war's closing stages. Without doubt, despite its shortcomings, the WW-88 was the finest German bomber to see extensive operational service. This aircraft was conceived at a 1935 meeting between high-ranking Luftwaffe officers and chief German aircraft designers, who were informed of the requirement for a Schnellbomber, a medium bomber with the speed of a fighter. Junkers was awarded the contract, the prototype making its maiden flight in 1936. From the war's outset, the WW-88 flourished, serving on every front and in almost every role. Apart from its use as a medium bomber, it also served as a night fighter, reconnaissance aircraft, torpedo bomber, mine layer, and finally as the lower component of the missile flying bomb combination. Highly regarded by the Allies, the WW-88 exemplified the German philosophy of using one good basic airframe for multiple tasks, rather than evolving specialized machines and thus complicating production. It's true that had the WW-88 proved less amenable to adaptation and modification, the Luftwaffe would have found itself in serious difficulties at a much earlier stage. Few inhabitants of England's capital and southern counties in the dramatic months of 1940 were unfamiliar with the distinctive, disagreeable note of the Heinkel He-111's engines. This machine, the first modern medium bomber acquired by the Luftwaffe, bore the major burden of the German bombing offensive against the British Isles during the main phase of the Battle of Britain. Despite shortcomings that became more marked as the war progressed, shortcomings largely due to continual modification and improvisation, the He-111 retained its place as a standard Luftwaffe combat aircraft throughout the war, produced in large numbers. This aircraft was twice taken out of mass production only to be returned to the lines when replacement types failed to materialize. During the war's opening phases, the Heinkel He-111 was undoubtedly a formidable offensive weapon, an elegant, well-built, well-planned aircraft with good flying characteristics. It was a thoroughbred, inheriting its shapely contours from its single-engine predecessor, the He-70 Blitz, which had been justifiably acclaimed as the most aerodynamically efficient airplane ever flown. Like many German warplanes of its era, the He-111 was first shown to the world as a civil aircraft, but its sleek, streamlined fuselage was obviously designed for maximum performance at the expense of passenger comfort. Intended from birth as one of the Luftwaffe's principal weapons for the future Blitzkrieg, the He-111 had placed Germany at the forefront of medium bomber development. It was, however, forced to soldier on long past its intended lifespan owing to the German aircraft industry's inability to produce a suitable replacement. already approaching obsolescence when called upon to carry the major burden of the Luftwaffe's bombing offensive against Britain. Despite continued improvements, it couldn't keep pace with the rapidly changing requirements of air warfare. And during the war's final years was no longer the formidable weapon that had attacked Poland in September 1939. One design that did manage limited production was the Junkers Ru-188. As early as 1939, Junkers had been working on the Ru-288, a completely new design far more advanced than preceding types. But when it became apparent this design wouldn't meet the specification calling for service entry by 1942, the Luftwaffe proposed modifying the Ru-88 instead. Hence, as an interim solution, the Ru-188 was born. In principle, Junkers took the forward fuselage section of the Ru-88 and added a new wing and tail unit. Originally designated Ru-8080, this was later changed to Ru-188. The first aircraft left the factory in June 1942 for operational use as a dive bomber, but with increased Allied defenses, it wasn't particularly successful. Its role changed to medium horizontal bomber and torpedo bomber for attacking Atlantic shipping. Further developments took the Ru-188 into the night fighter role, defending Germany's homeland against the increasing Allied strategic bombing campaign. To achieve greater speed and altitude without the disruption of introducing a completely new design, the Ru-188 was developed into a high-altitude bomber with a pressurized cockpit, later designated the Ru-388. In 1944, the Ru-188's role changed again when it was used as a pathfinder during that year's bombing campaign against England. Operating from 1942 until war's end, seeing action in Europe, the Mediterranean, Arctic, and Eastern fronts. The Ru-188, in its variety of roles, was among the most important of the Luftwaffe's operational aircraft. Bombing off England, bombs on England, so read the title of a stirring martial song that blared from loudspeakers all over Germany and the occupied territories during autumn 1940. With the accompaniment of roaring aero engines and beating drums, it was an impressive battle hymn. But whatever its psychological effect on the German populace, it was hardly destined to raise the spirits of Luftwaffe personnel who were fully aware their bombers lacked the range to effectively attack more than a small area of the British Isles. They knew the Luftwaffe's lack of a long-range strategic bomber enabled the RAF to concentrate virtually its entire defensive strength within a limited area, an area to which the Luftwaffe was forced to confine its attentions. And they knew this would sap their operational strength. Prototypes of four-engine heavies had been built but were abandoned and never reached production lines. They did, however, possess the Heinkel He-177 Grief, a long-range twin-engine bomber, destined to provide the most dismal chapter in the wartime record of the German aircraft industry. In-flight fires, aerodynamic troubles, and structural failures all contributed to this big bomber's unpopularity when it reached operational units. The faults were recognized too late, and when recognized, insufficient energy was devoted to eradicating them. There was nothing fundamentally wrong with the basic design, had effective measures been taken. The Luftwaffe might have possessed a heavy bomber comparable to, if not superior to, the best Allied machines of the same type. Aptly named Grief, meaning Griffin, this aircraft's chief claim to fame was being the only German heavy bomber to attain quantity production during the war years. One of very few entirely new German combat aircraft to progress from design boards to operational service during the conflict. But the advantages it offered were nullified by the German aircraft industry's inability to devote sufficient effort toward its perfection. Claimed by German propagandists as the scourge of Europe, the aircraft that conquered nations, the supreme weapon, the angularly ugly Junkers Ru-87 Stuka Dive bomber attained greater notoriety than any other weapon in the arsenal with which Germany launched World War II. It was one of the most vulnerable warplanes ever built. Slow, unwieldy, the natural prey of any competent fighter. Yet within the first 9 months of war, it acquired an almost legendary reputation. The German air staff itself was divided on dive bombing and the employment of the WW2. But the Polish campaign appeared to vindicate its proponents, the Stuka knocking out strongpoints, artillery batteries, and concentrations wherever the Poles sought to make a stand. When the German offensive against France in the Low Countries opened in May 1940, the WW2 repeated its earlier successes, blasting Allied armor and defenses, paralyzing whole armies, playing havoc with communications in vital rear areas, and pounding streams of refugees. With virtually no aerial opposition, the Stuka fully exploited the accuracy of bomb aiming inherent in the steep dive, as well as the demoralizing effect on personnel exposed to this form of attack. That terrifying scream of its Jericho trumpets as it plummeted earthward. But Stuka employment presumed air superiority, and the issue was settled in the Battle of Britain when, after a few abortive sorties during which their formations were decimated by Hurricanes and Spitfires, the dive bombers were withdrawn from the Cherbourg area and the WW2's career entered eclipse. The Stuka was aerodynamically an atrocity, ugly to the point of absurdity, virtually defenseless against modern fighters. Yet its distinctive gull-winged shape became the most feared silhouette by Germany's opponents. And this one aircraft type revolutionized the very fundamentals of warfare, proving that precision dive bombing could shatter defenses that conventional level bombing couldn't touch. That day didn't just change tactical doctrine. It changed how armies prepared for war, how soldiers looked at the sky with dread, listening for that unmistakable scream that meant death was diving straight toward them at terminal velocity.